In this lesson, we're going to tell an amazing story about the origin of chloroplasts. How did those green discs get inside plant cells or inside euglena? And before we get to that story, let's just review what we know about all life on Earth. This tree here represents the tree of life. It's something Darwin invited us to picture, where starting from some simple living organisms, which we'll call Luca, last universal common ancestor, evolutionary processes, natural selection, produced a diversity of species on Earth, and this happened over millions and millions, in fact billions of years. So the Earth might be, say, 4.5 billion years old. That's a lot of time for new species to evolve. Now, Darwin and modern biologists argue that the first living things were the simplest cells on Earth, and we call them bacteria cells. They're the smallest kind of cell, and they're the simplest kind of cell. In fact, they're also very numerous, and they're very diverse. And on this diagram here in the Tree of Life, we see two of the main branches on the Tree of Life are represented by species of bacteria. You'll remember the tips of the branches would be all the different kinds of species. So it's a little misleading here. There isn't just one kind of bacteria here and one kind of bacteria. There are millions. In fact, some biologists argue it's really not even possible to identify all the different species of bacteria because they change so much. But notice this big trunk of the Tree of Life in the middle here. All organisms on this main trunk here are composed of complex cells. So either they are a single-celled organism, but the cell is complex, or they're multi-celled, as in the plants, animals, and fungi. Now, to be a complex cell, what we're just going to say is you've got a nucleus. So down here we can see a picture of a complex cell. It's got a nucleus, so it's got a membrane-bound nucleus, DNA, usually in the form of chromosomes would be here. And in addition, there are other structures like mitochondria. So all living things on Earth are composed of complex cells except for bacteria. Bacteria do not have a nucleus, and they're much smaller than complex cells. Now, biologists, and starting with Darwin, argue that the first living thing was a cell, in part from just a general inference. If all living things on Earth are composed of cells, or a single cell, then it stands to reason that the first living thing was itself a cell. And so that characteristic, being a cell, has been passed on through reproduction to all living things on Earth today. So to tell the story of a chloroplast, then, let's just consider what these chloroplasts are briefly again. So we know that the chloroplasts are these green structures inside plant cells, and euglena also, those single-celled swimming organisms, have chloroplasts. And inside the chloroplast, complex chemistry is happening, and we call that chemistry photosynthesis. Light energy is being harnessed, being absorbed to power some chemistry that ends up building glucose. That's very, very useful for these organisms, right? Now, here's the surprising thing about these chloroplasts. So here we'll have our little picture of a chloroplast. And remember, the chloroplast is the one that interacts with light, absorbing the blue and the red. But here's the interesting thing about chloroplasts. First, chloroplasts are the size of bacteria. Second, chloroplasts have a circular piece of DNA like bacteria. And third, chloroplasts reproduce like bacteria. So now think about that a second. We've got these chloroplast structures where we've already learned that photosynthesis is happening. But they happen to be the size of bacteria. They actually have their own DNA, just like bacteria. And in fact, although we did not look for this originally under the microscope, they actually reproduce by simply splitting. One chloroplast will sort of split into two chloroplasts. Now, if you think about those three characteristics, some decades ago, some biologists thought of these three characteristics as clues to the origin of chloroplasts. It seems as if these chloroplasts have a lot of common features with bacteria. Could it be that chloroplasts and the ancestors of chloroplasts were once free-living bacteria? Well, in fact, there are bacteria today called cyanobacteria that are photosynthetic. And so biologists argue that photosynthesis actually evolved first in bacteria. And then somehow, some of these bacteria cells got inside of a larger cell to form the origin, the ancestors of plants and other organisms with chloroplasts. Now, the story we're going to tell has been given the name endosymbiosis, and we'll explain what that term means after we kind of see this event, this process unfolding in time. We'll start down here at the bottom with some kind of complex cell. Notice it has a mitochondria and it has a nucleus. And so this would be a single-celled organism that lived long ago in the oceans. Now, the argument here is that today's chloroplasts are the size of bacteria, have DNA like bacteria, and reproduce inside the cell because at some time in the past they were free-living bacteria, photosynthetic bacteria. So these bacteria, like cyanobacteria today, had evolved the ability to harness the energy of the sun to make glucose. Now notice they're small cells, right? And so the idea is one of these big cells living back then, as a part of its lifestyle, it would eat smaller cells. Well, imagine, shown in this middle picture here, imagine the big cell attempted to eat, as normal, one of the photosynthetic bacteria. Well, normally it would digest its food and break it apart and use those cell parts to construct its own cell parts. But what if somehow digestion failed? And so we would have a photosynthetic bacteria living inside the cytoplasm of the larger cell. This is the basic idea of this of the story of why it is that chloroplasts have characteristics like bacteria. The ancestors of today's chloroplasts were once photosynthetic bacteria that lived on their own. And they've got internalized by larger cells in the environment. So we're going to call this theory endosymbiosis. Endo referring to sort of within. One living thing is going to live within another. And the symbiosis is this idea of two species living in close association. Right, so we have one species, the cyanobacteria, going to be living inside another larger species, right, another type of cell. And that is certainly a close association, and it's one within another, so we'll call it endosymbiosis. Now, why would that have lasted? Well, the idea is that both types of cell would have gained an advantage from this relationship. So the photosynthetic bacteria would get protection from the larger cell, right? It would avoid being eaten, right? If you can live inside the larger cell, well, that's better than being out here and possibly eaten and successfully digested by another cell, right? So if you can live inside your predator, that's a pretty nice trick. Secondly, the big cell then gets some of the glucose made by the photosynthetic bacteria. Imagine from the big cell's point of view, you now have a glucose factory living inside you. Very, very useful indeed. Now, how exactly did the digestion fail? That's a matter of hypothesizing at this point. But one possibility is shown here. See, during normal digestion, the prey cell, right, the bacteria in this case, would be trapped inside a food vacuole. We'll learn more about this type of process coming up. And then digestive proteins would break it apart, and then the nutrients absorbed into the cell. Well, what if the cyanobacteria-like organism, broke out of the food vacuole, so the digestive process wouldn't have happened, and so now it could live here in the cytoplasm. And this would explain then why it can reproduce. It already had reproductive ability. It was a living cell that would reproduce out on its own. Well, it continues to reproduce inside the cell today. So the reason why chloroplasts have their own DNA, are the size of bacteria, and reproduce is because their ancestors were living bacteria that were internalized and took up residence inside of the cytoplasm of another cell. But that relationship was beneficial to both parties, and so the entire cooperative arrangement gave these individuals an advantage, and so evolution has favored this relationship. Now, in this diagram, we are showing the big cell as having a nucleus, but it also has mitochondria, right? And it's now acquiring, in a sense, a new resident the chloroplast, or this would have been bacteria at the time, but today we call them chloroplasts. Let's take a closer look at the mitochondria themselves. Now, we've already been learning that mitochondria are critically involved in producing energy, and they do so by helping to break down sugar, right, glucose, in the presence of oxygen. And the structure produces a lot of energy molecules and then waste products of water and carbon dioxide. So we often think of the mitochondria as the power plant of the cell. It produces energy by, in a sense, burning sugar in the presence of oxygen. But here's some interesting facts about mitochondria as well. So here we see a complex cell. Here's mitochondria. Turns out that mitochondria also are the size of bacteria. They also have their own DNA, and it's circular, like bacteria species today. And mitochondria also reproduce, right, inside the cell. And again, it's just kind of like chloroplasts do. The single mitochondria, kind of like a bacterium, will just go through reproduction. So the mitochondria will sort of split into two mitochondria. Now, we'll be learning later that the DNA of the original mitochondrion will have to be duplicated, so each daughter mitochondria will have its own copy of DNA, just like bacteria reproduction. So mitochondria as well have characteristics like bacteria, and that invites the hypothesis, now considered to be a theory because there's a lot of evidence backing this, that in fact there were two major examples of endosymbiosis in the past. So a long time ago, a sort of a big bacteria cell swallowed up a smaller bacteria type of cell, and this would have been the formation of a more complex cell, and these organisms here would have been mitochondria, or they would have been the ancestors of mitochondria. Right? And then one of these types of cells, right, they would be the ancestors of animals, right, that all animal cells have mitochondria, but some of these complex cells went on to incorporate the photosynthetic bacteria, the cyanobacteria, right? So a second endosymbiosis would have produced an ancestor of plants and other organisms with chloroplasts. So in the history of life on Earth, there have been two really important kinds of endosymbiotic events, and both help us understand how it is that these structures inside complex cells, mitochondria and chloroplast, how it is that they have characteristics like bacteria. And the reason is because these organisms had ancestors that were free-living bacteria. So now let's sort of step back and add the dimension of time to this story of endosymbiosis. We'll start on the left here with Luca, the last universal common ancestor, a primitive kind of bacteria cell. Over hundreds of millions of years, it underwent evolutionary processes, reproduction and mutations leading to new species forming. Well, some of those bacteria evolved the capacity to do photosynthesis. And today, there are still bacteria present today called cyanobacteria and other species that continue to perform photosynthesis. And remember, photosynthesis, the capturing of light and turning it into glucose, releases a whole lot of oxygen, right? And that was an important event in the history of life on Earth. Because as we'll see later, animals made of multiple cells require a lot of oxygen because they're very mobile creatures, and that requires a lot of energy. And you need oxygen to power that kind of animal lifestyle. In addition, the oxygen released into the atmosphere created an ozone layer, and that protected life on Earth from some of the harmful effects of solar radiation. But meanwhile, so photosynthesis evolved in some bacteria. Other bacteria evolved the ability to use oxygen. And the first endosymbiosis then would have been some larger bacteria eating but failing to digest one of these oxygen-using bacteria. This will be the ancestor of mitochondria. And so we see here the cell has also evolved a nucleus here, but it's going to go on to evolve into single-celled organisms like amoeba down here, and then animals, multi-celled animals. All animal cells have a nucleus, and they have mitochondria. The mitochondria today is the descendant of a free-living oxygen-using bacteria that was internalized in a process called endosymbiosis. On this part of the diagram, we see one of these single-celled organisms, went on to incorporate yet another resident through endosymbiosis, but this resident was a photosynthetic bacteria. And this created then the ancestor of organisms that have chloroplasts in them today. Some are single-celled, like Euglena, and then the multi-celled ones like the plants. So in the history of life on Earth, again, lots of important evolution was happening with single-celled organisms. Right, for a couple billion years, it was all single-celled organisms. Only in the last, 600, 700 million years do we get some of the multi-celled organisms like plants and animals. So important chemistry was evolving in the earliest of bacteria, and that set up the pathway for the endosymbiosis events that we see here, leading to more complicated and larger living things on planet Earth. And finally, if you remember the tree of life that Darwin invited us to consider, usually trees have a thick trunk, and then as you kind of go up the tree, right, the branches kind of branch off. But usually on a tree, the branches never sort of converge. They never combine. Two thin branches usually don't combine to form a thick branch. The thickest parts of the tree are at the bottom, and then it gets progressively thinner as you go up. Well, that model has to be revised now. Based on the study of chloroplasts and mitochondria. So in a picture over here, we're going to see at the sort of the base of the tree of life, what we have here is some simple bacteria evolving, but endosymbiosis suggests that two separate species merged into one, right? And so that's kind of unusual. It doesn't fit with the precise tree metaphor because branches usually don't converge. And it happened a second time with this cell here as it incorporated the photosynthetic bacteria to form the ancestors of plants and other organisms like Euglena, right? So cyanobacteria today are the descendants of some of these first photosynthetic bacteria. They were incorporated by a cell, and prior to that, the oxygen-using bacteria, the ancestors of mitochondria, were also incorporated into a larger cell. So two endosymbiotic events means that the tree of life has some weird characteristics. Some of the branches on the tree of life ended up coming together to form new organisms with more complex features. And just to notice where multicellularity evolved here. So this organism here, this single-celled organism, a nucleus and a mitochondria, some of them went on to evolve into multi-celled organisms like animals and fungi. Some of these single-celled organisms continue to be single-celled and evolved into the many species of protists like amoeba and paramecia and so on. And the plants, of course, and protists like Euglena with chloroplasts can trace their ancestry back to this endosymbiotic event right here. Of course, we still have bacteria today, and there are many species of bacteria. They are a very successful form of life, very small, simple cells, and they've evolved great diversity as they live in many different places on Earth. But the incredible story that endosymbiosis tells is that two species of bacteria united to form more complex cells. And many of the creatures that we love and know well, the plants and the animals, are the result of these endosymbiotic events in the Earth's past.